Hello everyone, and welcome back once again to CBR MTG. This time we're taking the reins once again to talk about National Highlander Championships 2024. And I'm joined here today by Jordan. G'day, Jordan.
Hey, how you going?
Very well, thank you. And also Graham is here with us as well.
Hello again. Lovely to have everyone back here with us. So, as Angus has said, this is the breakdown of CanCon, which is the National Highlander Championship up in Canberra, held on Australia Day weekend for better want of a name. Whether you celebrate that holiday or not is up to you. And we had 191 players playing it out over 8 rounds, and at the end of it we had 8 players left at the top who played it out into the night all the way to about 11:30 from memory. First place was Chifley playing Maru Initiative, Max on Jund, Liam on Blue Moon, Thomas on Bots, Kyle on Grixis with White, or Grixis as we like to say, Matthew on also Grixis Midrange, Braden on Goblins, and our very own Jordan in this podcast with a 5-color Omnath Walks variant. What can you tell me, Angus?
I think we're going to get stuck into a lot of data today because we'll link it in the show notes, of course. But we previously did a data analysis video for CanBrawl, which was you and me, and that was like 70 players, and it was really good and it was really informative. And I think it helped sort of set the tone for meta discussion because it feels like sometimes we take those MTG top 8 websites for granted when it comes to community-driven formats, because that data isn't necessarily readily available. I think long story short out of all of this is that in the 7 Point Highlander podcast recently, a lot of feedback that came from players at the event was, I played 8 different decks that day, or I played 7 different decks that day. And you'll be able to see it as we move over to the Archetypes distribution. But it was relatively well spread. We had sort of combo taking up 26%, aggro taking up 29%, midrange taking up 32%, and then combo control leading up the rear with the 11.1%. And also the color distribution was relatively consistent as well with that, more or less between that sort of 16 to 25% range distribution of colors. So I think people in modern or people in other sort of 4-odd formats would see 7% of the best deck being 7% of the meta or something and actually be like, that's kind of cool. It's like we actually saw a really, really long list of decks that only had one showing. And we also had people just bringing their pet decks and stuff. So I think this is going to be really nice, really chunky information.
Yeah, I think also one thing to note about this event is it's a mixture of some of your most enfranchised players in the format who've spent a lot of time playing this particular format. And with 191 players, you're getting a lot of people who are coming out for the allure of a really sweet prize pool, or because it's the biggest event on that weekend, who might not necessarily play as much Highlander as some of the people that are in the event. And so you do get a lot of those decks that would traditionally be not as played, showing up 1 or 2 copies at a time because they're the decks that people have access to for that weekend. So it's important when we look through the archetypes and distributions that we look at the decks with high percentage shares, because those, I guess, are the common cards that are showing up in a lot of events that are happening across the format.
Yeah. And we're going to go through sort of each archetype in a lot of detail, so strap yourselves in. But just to sort of kick us off, something that's worth noting is that the most performing, the decks with the most copies were Jund with 7.4%, Breach with 6.8%, Grixis Midrange with sort of 5.2%, Reanimator with 4.76%, and that's 14 total, 13 total, 11 total, 9 total. So if you're doing so that's where you sort of hear where that opinion's coming from. If you go to a 8-round, 190-person event, 14 decks being the same is actually not that big a deal. And I think that's something that we could really take home from this. So I think probably to start us off, maybe we talk about points. When we talk about points, the committee looks at points all the time, obviously. It's the main bread and butter, and this is how we balance our format for 7 Point Highlander. Of course, you can only play 7 points in your deck. and decisions about how many people play what or what's being played the most come into conversation quite a lot. So, Graham, what can you tell us about points and what people are playing and what that impact is?
Yeah, so uh, I think the biggest thing to come out of this weekend was just the allure of Mana Crypt and the fast mana decks as uh, something as a force in the format. There was, in terms of a cumulative point spend on Mana Crypt, 156 point spent, which is almost twice what the next copy spell is, which was Ragavan, and that was for 39 total copies of Mana Crypt being played. Uh, Otherwise, some of the biggest played points were Force of Will, Deathrite Shaman, and Ragavan, Ren and Six, Minsk and Boo, and then finally the One Ring. So outside of the Force of Will, it's a lot of very fair cards being played rather than the things you would traditionally think of as the more broken points. And it's definitely shying away from blue cards as well, which is um, definitely not how the format has traditionally looked.
Yeah, this has been a really blue format for a really long time, and like we see Snap Custom Age at 24 copies. That's like kind of in that uh, top 10, top 15 sort of number of points spent, and that's like one that we see a lot. Force of Will is also a card that we often see on the top of the leaderboard for points spend. But yeah, it has been really interesting to see the rise of fair cards. I mean, we had this like sort of 2 years or so of where Ragavan, Minsk and Boo, the One Ring, like we can always put all these cards together, and then we don't even have to play blue at all. And I think that's reflected in our top 8 as well, where we had quite a few non-blue decks, and it was like nice to see. It
Yeah.
was nice to see, yeah.
Even the finals being Maru versus Jund is very different to uh, the kind of archetypes that we would see in the past as well. So I think that's pretty refreshing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in regards to the lowest point spend, I think we're actually this might also be something that happens is pretty new with CanCon as well. Is that we usually have like a list seemingly of I don't know maybe 5 or 6 cards that didn't see any play. No one wanted to give them a go, but I guess that's the benefit with an event like this is that everyone's given everything a go, and the only thing that we didn't see a copy of was Time Twister, Mox Pearl, and Mox Sapphire. I think Moxen come and go on the sort of played points scale. I think Time Twister is probably towards the lower end, but it is interesting that we had Academy Walks decks that opted to not even play Time Twister. So you can see sort of where people are spending their points. I think another point to show is just the 1 point. The people that only brought one copy. So famously argued Library of Alexandria, one copy. Mox Jet, Time Vault, and Ancestral Recall also at one copy.
Just like you said, with people deciding to whether or not to bring a deck along is going to affect something being played, because I know that Mox Sapphire and Time Twister do occasionally get played in the Blue Red Wheels deck, and just someone deciding not to play that means that those decks don't get played on a given day.
An interesting feature of the kind of cards at the bottom of this list is too there are some archetypes down there that have in the community a lot of people are quite passionate about. Some cards that stick out to me in the bottom of this kind of less than 5 copies are Crop Rotation, Fast Bond, Gamble, True Name Nemesis. There are a lot of people that are really vocal about those cards being either overpointed. Ancestral Recall is a good example. And especially, all the discourse around Gamble with the recent Underworld Breach, Gamble Intuition kind of pointing and decision tree. I think when you look at decks that have traditionally been quite prominent in this format, they often used to play cards like Crop Rotation, Fast Bond, Natural Order, and so on, and those cards are really underrepresented. It could be that you that these had been pushed out, or perhaps people just chose not to register those decks in a format where they're not as strong as they used to be. But there is something there that these cards are consistently being underrepresented and underplayed across data sets that we have
Yeah.
from events like this.
Absolutely, and I think, and you sort of hit the nail on the head as well with what we're looking at, which is I'm looking at crop rotation, I'm looking at gifts ungiven, I'm looking at natural order, imperial seal, demonic tutor, tinker, gamble. Like we're looking at a lot of really powerful tutors that must sit on the points list, even if they're kind of not that powerful. But I mean, 4 people registered natural order, and that's like, I feel like probably fine at 0, but it's still like an amount, like, so it's interesting to see what cards sort of drift to the bottom. And I think it's definitely, as you said, maybe people are choosing to just bring a mid-range deck to this event as opposed to bringing a combo deck, which is why you might be seeing these combo pointed cards towards the bottom.
Yep, definitely. Aside from, I think there's been an uptick in Flash-related combo pieces. I think Merchant Scroll, there were 2 copies in the top 16. I think it's looking pretty healthy that a deck like Flash is performing well. There were a high number of Flash decks in the positive win rate brackets of the event. Nothing that kind of jumps out to me as kind of this is a red flag, but some of those Flash-related combo pieces, Merchant Scroll, Mystical Tutor, so on, seeing an uptick in play. And I know Mystical Tutor was depointed recently.
Yes.
And I think, going from pretty much being unplayed or underplayed to 20 copies, I think shows that it was a good decision. Nothing too broken has emerged from that yet. And with the spread of blue points available to players, meaning that you can build those kind of blue X decks in various ways, whether it's Grixis, combo with Simic in Flash, or Thassa's Oracle uses blue as well, or blue-red Prowess or Tempo in Rug.
Yeah.
Well, we did end up with a total of 7 copies of Flash being played over the weekend. So definitely that's something to take into account, as you said, with the point spend. And Sav has recently made a fairly impassioned plea to have Demonic Tutor reduced in points, so maybe that could make a wider variety of points seen in the combo spectrum. And you can have a listen to the last 7-Point Highlander podcast if you want to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Some interesting points. Just some small ones. Underworld Breach, 13 copies. Intuition, 16. So there are people sort of mixing it up a little bit. It's not just like locked in. We feel like Underworld Breach is kind of locked in for Luris, 22 copies, and Intuition and Underworld Breach. But it's interesting to see people going away from the Intuition. At least 3 people have decided that they don't want to try Intuition anymore in their Underworld Breach deck. Some other important notes: Tainted Pact, 11. Thassa's Oracle, 10. Interesting. They usually go together quite well, but obviously someone's playing Tainted Pact and not exactly worrying about its interaction with Thassa's Oracle. And I think we're gonna probably deep dive a little bit into Omnath and Omnath Walks and Omnath Midrange, but important to note as well, Time Walk, 9 copies. A-Call, 1.
So we are talking about the pointed cards, but let's have a look before we go into the deep dives at what the recent point changes are as well. The most recent change was for just after CanCon, which had all 5 committee members there. So they were able to discuss this in person, which is something that I don't believe has ever actually happened before. The decision they made was to increase points on 7 decks with no actual reductions, which is the first time that's also happened in a long time. And their decision was that they expressed was that they wanted to decrease the overall level of the power of the format, while at the same time not reducing anything so that they could see where the ground settled before they made any further changes. So the 7 updates we got were Goblin Recruiter up to 1 point, Caves of Chaos Adventurer to 1 point, Mana Crypt to 5 points, Renin 6 to 2 points, Orcish Bowmasters to 1 point, Fourth Lingus to 1 point, and Spellseeker to 1 point. What do you think about those changes, Angus?
We actually had all 5 committee members at CanCon, and it's very easy to believe that they were making some pretty important decisions after that event. And we did see that. I mean, after that event, we did see that points change. We saw Kush Bowmasters to 1. We saw Goblin Recruiter, which was a little bit off the wall, but a nice nod to Goblins everywhere. I think Goblins is having its time in the sun at the moment, and I think if you're a Goblins player, instead of being furious, a little bit of pride. Goblin Recruiter doesn't go anywhere but Goblin Tribal, so I think that's kind of nice. But we saw Fourth Aerolingus go up as well, and some really interesting stuff on the list. But what it ends up meaning is that people who are free rolling Caves of Chaos, people who are free rolling Bowmasters, Fourth Aerolingus, even splashing for it sometimes, now their deck is like 11 points, and that's part of the reason why pointings like that happen, is to like make those best decks have less points. I think I'm a little bit of the opinion that it's maybe better to make bad like D point cards to make other combos stronger, so we can raise the overall power level of the format. But I don't begrudge most of these decisions at all. I think it's like fine for really good decks to just cop it a little bit, because we're getting stronger cards every year, and this is one thing that we have in our back pocket to protect ourselves from that.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a really key moment there where, when pointing a card, looking at the decks that it goes in that aren't doing the broken things at the top of the format. So I guess Gamble is a great example, where it was in lands and also in Underworld Breach. At the same time, Green Sun Zenith went down, a card that was underplayed, and is a really good fix of, okay, we're going to point this card, which is going to target a particular deck at the top of the metagame, and we're also going to make sure there's no neutral net negative effect on another deck that is hit by that pointing as well. I think going a step further and also depointing a card unique to those archetypes would power that deck up and kind of maybe raise that. But I think it's right for the committee, especially in this case with 7 cards, going up in points, to really take it slow and work out like if that has a significant shakeup. And even on the note of Goblin Recruiter, I think that's a card that could actually have easily slotted into Red Black Eclipse. They have 5 or 6 decent targets: Bombardiers, Squee, Rabblemaster. Even you could put Ardors into that kind of deck. That actually would mean that a Goblin Recruiter at 0 in that deck could just draw them 4 really powerful cards in a row to end the game.
Yeah.
And Bombardiers is insane. And if you've been seeing other Eternal formats, that card has been making massive waves. So I definitely think that's a pretty good hindsight pointing to go, well, this hits Goblins, yes, but it also stops some other decks from possibly free rolling that card as more broken Goblins enter this format.
Yeah. I think some of it's really interesting. Some of it is like Ren and 6 has been on the points list for a pretty long time. Mana Crypt obviously has been on the points list for a really long time, but copped a lot of eyes on it since Red Black Eclipse. I think Moonshine was a little bit beforehand, which is just like red white power. We're calling them Stompy decks, and we'll talk about the archetypes soon, of course. But powering out 3 or 4 or 5 drops is like not necessarily ramp, but it's not necessarily mid-range. But I think the crux of those decks was that Mana Crypt, and that was one of the reasons we saw Ancient Tomb get a point as well. So it kind of makes sense that Mana Crypt would get an extra point. Although, again, with the 8 point stuff, it's like nicer to have reserve list cards perhaps get pointed instead. But because it lowers the configurations of 8 point lists as well. But yeah, I mean, also Ren and 6 Orcish Bowmasters. We noticed that Spellseeker was on the watch list and then went from the watch list to a point. Probably pretty safe, honestly. It's like a nice way to point Time Walk without pointing Time Walk, and it was prevalent, 28 in the event for in CanCon, and 1 in the top 8. So still very, very played card. And I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. Besides Goblin Recruiter, we saw 22 copies of Caves of Chaos Adventurer, 39 copies of Mana Crypt, 37 copies of Ren and 6, 54 copies of Orcish Bowmasters, 54 copies of Fourth Aerolingus, 28 copies of Spellseeker. In the watch list, something that's really illuminating, of course, is Ubiquity is on the menu again. Fury, 7 in the top 8. So nearly all the decks in the top 8 were playing Fury. 86 in the total event as well. So you consider like Mana Crypt was good enough to get a point to 5 with 39 people in the event. Orcish Bowmasters to 1 with 54. Fury, 86 copies. So kind of like pretty important. And Reanimate also gives people a bit of a shock with 64 copies in the event with 5 in the top 8. No, you're not reading that incorrectly, my Reanimator enjoyers. There was only, I think, maybe 9 Reanimator decks in the event, and 64 players decided that Reanimate was a good enough card to play.
So I think your comment about Fury being ubiquitous is interesting because it's an expensive card mana-wise to try and put onto the battlefield, and obviously it does have that pitch cost advantage that you can play it without paying that mana cost. But at what point do you think there needs to be a difference between pointing a card to correct for it and having people just build their decks a little bit differently to adjust for how the metagame is shifting?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I mean, it's obviously a consideration that creatures are everywhere at the moment, and some of these creatures you need to get off the battlefield immediately. Not only was Fury really widely played, there actually are lots of copies of Pyrokinesis registered in the event as well, which is a card that people would have probably laughed you off if you were playing a Pyrokinesis. I think it's also something to note that Fury and Reanimate play really well together. You can cash in your Fury and go down a card, trade your resources for 2 of your opponent's creatures, then Reanimate your Fury later, remove their creatures off the board again, and then keep a 3/3 double striking attacker on your side of the board. So those 2 cards play really well together, and I know that the committee had mentioned that they would probably point one and then see if it affects the other. And obviously, red black being a really prevalent strategy in either Jund, Grixis, or red black means that all of those archetypes, while they only represented 10% each or thereabouts, they're all playing Fury and Reanimate, those core cards in that shell. And Orcish Bowmaster is another example of a card, 54 copies. Fable of the Mirror Breaker, another one, I think had 80 copies as well. Some really prevalent red cards and black cards that are up there in the most played cards in the format outside of Mental Misstep and Lightning Bolt.
Worth mentioning, of course, Mental Misstep. Again, everybody, most played card in the format. 147 copies of Mental Misstep, and there was 8 in the top 8. And I think that tells you what you need to know. Like, we had a bots deck in the top 8. We had actually, this is like a really important point to correct, is that Orcish Bowmaster is actually 90 in the event, not 54. 90 is a lot. So at the top played cards, besides lands, so obviously you're going to get your fetch lands, you're going to get your dual lands. Mental Misstep, 147 copies. Lightning Bolt, 124 copies, as Jordan mentioned before. And then Brainstorm, 96, Ponder, 93. Orcish Bowmasters, 90. Fable, 86. Fury, 86. So now we're kind of like, you put all those cards together and you've almost got Grixis Midrange, which is probably one of the reasons why we saw a lot of Grixis Midrange at the event as well, is that these cards are strong and it's like no denying it. And it's nice to see Lightning Bolt at the top. It's nice to see Brainstorm at the top. Like, we hold these cards really dear to our heart. I think we might be seeing, and depending on what we do with Misstep, we have to have a discussion about that, of course. But like, maybe we're seeing Fury, Orcish Bowmasters, like maybe we're seeing these cards either join the ranks of our missteps and our lightning bolts and our brainstorms, or maybe they fade away. Like, I don't know how many people are going to be playing Bowmasters at one point. It'll be interesting to see if Fury is part of that discussion as well.
Bowmasters is an interesting card at one point because it can encourage people to make deck building decisions that make Orcish Bowmasters better at one point. If I'm a player that thinks Orcish Bowmasters back at one point, I can put Sylvan Library back into my deck, I can put X1s back into my deck, I can play my Dark Confidant. It actually makes the people that are paying 1 point for Orcish Bowmasters get even more value. I know leading into CanCon, lots of players were considering the ubiquity of Bowmasters and not playing cards like Sylvan Library or Dark Confidant and so on. So it does have that factor where it plays really well the more people don't play around it, and as a card goes up in points, it's more likely that you'd expect, okay, there'll be less Bowmasters. I know that in all of my subsequent testing outside of CanCon, playing decks with black, I've got Bowmasters in all of them, so
Yeah.
I think it's too good at the moment still not to cut.
Yeah, that's super reasonable.
I would say that there's definitely been some elf players who have come up to me and said, like, I cannot play this deck at the moment. I have a field full of Bowmasters and Ren and Six, and both of those cards just got points. So maybe we do see a return to that 1/1 mana ramp kind of deck because of these changes we've seen. And then you just have to watch out for the Fury still being in the format.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see where we land on that because obviously Fury and Bowmasters go together pretty well in regards to what they do to people who like to play X1s, and it can be like such a huge blowout for when you're playing uh, when you want to play those creature decks. Like, and I know that the exalted creatures see the Hyrox, they see a little play. I don't see very much Birds of Paradise anymore, but what I'm seeing a lot of course, is Deathrite Shaman and Delighted Halfling, like all these cards that are like accidentally X2s because they get around Bowmasters, and it'll be interesting to see how that changes. I know people weren't too deterred by Ragavan 40 copies in the event, supposedly being the cure, but yeah, still be interesting to see what the Orcish Bowmasters pointing does to our overall meta and whether or not that changes it.
So, with these recent changes in points, uh, what comes out still playable after after this shakeup?
I think decks that didn't really gain any points at like first glance would be your Blue Moon deck, which has been in a lot of top eights or close to top eights over the last year. Doesn't need to cut any cards from its deck list there. Obviously, Grixis is only plus 1 point, so they just need to look at what will they cut, whether it will be the Bowmasters or the Gush or rearranging something on the Dreadhorde Arcanist or the Deathrite Shaman. They had a pretty good spread of points where they could play a lot of good one-pointed cards. Jund loses a few points there in the sense of Renin 6 and Orcish Bowmasters, both really key cards to the Jund strategy and how Jund punishes decks playing blue for drawing so many cards. So I think that those decks are still very much playable. I know that Time Walk obviously now can't really play any flexible Plan B cards in the sense it's paying 6 points for its combo, so it can't play Ren and 6 or Oko or Uro, but it still can play the One Ring or Mana Drain or Fourth Theolingus, which Spellseeker still picks up, so it's a pretty good alternate win condition. And then, of course, the initiative decks that have picked up a few points. Red-white base initiative decks picking up points on Mana Crypt, Fourth Earlingus, and Caves of Chaos Adventurer, which I think when you look at the numbers, Caves of Chaos Adventurer was played to the same kind of percentages Seasoned Dungeoneer and White Plume Adventurer. So they're great ways for those decks to put their spare points in, but with Mana Crypt going up as well, there becomes less and less spare points. And so they actually have to pick which initiative creatures do they want to build their deck around. Is it White Plume Adventurer and Seasoned Dungeoneer, which really reward putting creatures on the board early, making sure you can attack and you can get the most out of your Seasoned Dungeoneer, which just cannot be blocked and kill your opponent? Or are you building more red initiative kind of creatures where the actual other non-pointed initiative creatures in red are not very good? I know that the Mardu initiative deck was playing a whole range of the black initiative creatures as well. Ravenloft Adventurer, I think it is, that gives things hit counters.
Yep.
So there's definitely still room to experiment there with those creatures. But in terms of the key decks that were in the top 8, I think they're all still playable. The committee did a good job at making sure nothing is kicked out of the format. A lot of people playing Thassa's Oracle might disagree around Spellseeker being pointed, but I think the deck is still playable. It's just nowhere near as consistent. And whether that influences how people go back to the drawing board with that deck, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, and I think the big loser from this is Chifley specifically, which is so funny because we saw a lot of initiative decks, Naya initiative, and we still see them a lot. But we also saw the rise of red, white, and red, black. And what Chifley did in his his first place winning deck, by the way, 11 points now. So that's where you can see it's kind of been targeted. But this is what we're looking at now is basically like Mardu Scam or Mardu Evoke Elementals, like we're actually just trying to mulligan to put a giant initiative creature on the battlefield, or the combo with Reanimate and Grief. But when we're talking about initiative decks, and we'll delve into it more later, of course, again when we go into our archetypes discussion. But what we're going to call initiative decks from now on, playing unpointed initiative creatures. And that's like, you're really targeted at that point. I think if you're playing Seasoned Dungeoneer and you're playing White Plume Adventurer, maybe you're actually just mono white. You know, if you're playing also Caves of Chaos Adventurer, maybe it's red white moonshine. You know, so it's like, it's funny to think where we draw the line, but we as a team, the three of us, do not want to call every creature deck that we see an initiative deck, because creature decks are creature decks. You know, I want to start calling stuff Naya Zoo. I want to start calling stuff, Knight of the Reliquary mid-range. You know, but because they're playing an initiative deck, we're calling it playing an initiative card. We're calling it initiative.
Think it's a little bit disingenuous to say that the committee were targeting Chifley's deck, because all of the cards that were pointed in his deck are ones that were already on the chopping board and on the watch list. And I think what Chifley has done instead has identified a weakness in the points list. These are the most powerful cards that I think are underpointed, and put them into a singular deck and managed to exploit the weakness that was there in the format. And that has been corrected fairly quickly, because there were cards that were on the watch list. People were saying, hey, these are going to go up soon. But in the meantime, there is a deck here. No one else has built it, and I think I can do things with it.
I agree. That's probably a more accurate way to put it. Is that we're not pointing players. We're pointing stuff that's already on the watch list, and it happens in the other direction. I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, and I think if you listen to the podcast that Vance recorded after the event, and what a lot of players who play a lot of the format will say is they look for these cards that are underpointed or cards that should be pointed, and they try to build decks around exploiting that weakness, in the sense of trying to find those cards that are really powerful that you can jam into a deck and make work. And obviously Chifley's deck was built to exploit that mechanic, which is still, or maybe not now, or at the time he felt maybe perhaps was underpointed. And you could fit a lot of those powerful cards in there, even things like Shieldred, which you can power out in the same archetype. Cards like Douthie Voidwalker are really good in the metagame right now. Obviously, you would never put a point on Douthie Voidwalker, but it's a great card that fits into that color scheme, and also has great kind of wider application into the field. So really great deck building, and highlights the ability to understand a format a bit deeper than just looking at the key archetypes, but rather what are people trying to do, and how can I build my deck to utilize powerful cards to stop what they're doing and win the game.
Absolutely. So, moving on to kind of the way that we structure our archetypes, we mentioned before sort of an idea of how they're split up, how they're distributed. If we go over to the archetypes, we had 61 cards in mid-range and 56 in aggro decks, just to start us off. And the funny thing is that I think you're like kind of on the line when you're talking about initiative decks and stompy decks, about whether or not they're mid-range decks, so they want to go to the mid-range, or the mid-game, or are they aggro decks? And I think we've used MTG Top 8 as like a source of truth, where they've declared that if you're spending a bunch of resources to put some giant threats on the battlefield and hope for the best, we're going to call that aggro. It's not necessarily ramp, it's not necessarily mid-range, it's definitely not necessarily aggro, but it's like using a bunch of resources to try and put your hand down as quickly as possible. And I think that's probably where we've put Stompy in that aspect.
Yeah, so it's mid-range definitely is something that looks more at trading resources and having removal on tap to protect their board of mid-range threats, whereas the Stompy decks are really just trying to get from turn 1 to turn 4 as soon as they possibly can, skipping turns 2 and 3 in between.
Yeah, I would say they're trying to get to that mid-game point ahead of you, in the sense of they're trying to put out their threat that a mid-range deck would usually just cast on turn 3 or turn 4 and play that on turn 2. So it's like White Plume Adventurer or Seasoned Dungeoneer are fine mid-range cards in a mid-range deck that cast a Seasoned Dungeoneer on turn 4. But when your Stompy opponent goes Ancient Tomb, Lotus Petal, Simian Spirit Guide, Seasoned Dungeoneer on turn 1, you're like, okay, they've expended all their resources into putting this card on the battlefield. I'm just going to die to it unless I have an answer right now.
Yeah. It's an interesting inverse on, and I heard someone mention it in Discord as well, saying that it's kind of a tempo deck, which is a funny way to think about it because we see tempo as like daze, spell pierce, play a little threat, and protect the queen. But if it's whether or not it's a Delver and a spell pierce, or if it's a mana crypt and a white plume adventurer, like you can kind of see the similarities there. Tempo also classified as an aggro deck in here. So to go through it really quickly for aggro, we had 56 aggro decks in the format in the CanCon, 29% of the total meta. 28 pure aggro decks with one in the top 8. And I'll read out the ones that are more than one copy because there was a few that was just one copy, which is great. We had 8 goblins with one in the top 8, 5 mono red, 4 mono white, 3 5-color aggros, which is interesting, like a domain sort of aggro, and then 2 affinity. For Stompy, there was 9 red-black eclipse, 6 red-white moonshine, and 3 red-green midrange. So it's funny when we're naming them differently, but they're kind of doing a similar thing, with red-green kind of being the more well-known version of that, where you're going like Mana Dork Blood Moon, Mana Dork something, Rabble Master. So they're kind of like the progenitor of that ideal. But red, white Moonshine and red, black Eclipse have now started to eclipse them and that process, and just going straight for that fast mana with lands and Mana Crypt. For tempo always looks the same to me whenever I see the lists. Some notable, maybe only one notable thing in there or two is the 5-color domain, so like 5-color tempo, and then also Merfolk, which is really nice to see. But yeah, every time we talk about tempo, there's 9 in the event. Most of them were UR or UR white or UR green prowess. And the only other exception being blue-green tempo. So everyone had a go at tempo, nine copies in the event. But yeah, when we're talking about aggro, we're looking towards those pure aggro decks turning little creatures sideways, and those stompy decks trying to push out a 3-drop or a 4-drop as quickly as possible. Do you want to take us to mid-range, Graham?
Yeah, let's have a look at the mid-range. So there was 61 decks in total, which was about a third of the field. And the biggest archetype we had there was the Omnath Walks. The Omnath deck, I should say. We've classified both the Walks deck and the mid-range deck as both being mid-range and combined because they're really just playing the same fair plan, and then Walks has that just additional 4 or 5 cards which has a game-winning combo on the end, but a lot of the time they are beating you down with that fair plan if they can't get that time walk online. After that, we've got Jund. We have the Grixis mid-range deck, which was a lot of that was the bus stop deck, which was designed by a Canberra-based team called Bus Stop, believe it or not. And then from there, we have some initiative decks, some Bug, some Jeskai, and a few other single ones. We've got Nyapod, the 4-color Lewis deck, Bank Company, and everyone's favorite from Darv, 5-color Planeswalkers.
And we appreciate that 5-color Planeswalkers list immensely.
I just missed the time when it used to have every single Planeswalker ever printed in it. It stopped doing that when it got to about 95 cards, and now it's back to being a 60-card deck again, which is, it's very sad.
Yeah, really tough choices you have to make, because Planeswalkers did have their time in the sun for a little while, Moving us on, and I mean, mid-range decks, I mean, this was nice. I mean, they usually say, like, wait until Jund is good and then the format is good. Well, baby, Jund is good, and, like, we were quabbling over the difference between Jund, Omnath Walks in mid-range, but it was like 6 or 7 each. It was pretty close, 9 and 7, I think. It wasn't too much of a difference between the two. And I think if you saw Omnath Walks a little bit further down and Omnath Midrange a little bit further down than that, you'd probably say, well, why aren't we connecting these two together? So yeah, 16 Omnath decks, 14 Jund decks, and 11 Grixis. And I think that was like what people were expecting from that mid-range plan. And it was strong. 5 copies, 5 mid-range decks in the top 8 is a really nice showing.
I guess there's something to say about the Omnath decks homogenizing those 3 to 4 color archetypes, in the sense we don't see a lot of Naya mid-range outside of Initiative, or Bant mid-range outside of the one Bant Company deck, or Abzan decks there. They often turn into a point where you put these Abzan or Bant or Naya decks together, and then you go, oh, well, if I add this other color and splashing is really easy in 7 point, I can just play Omnath, and then I get all the good 4-color cards. So there is something to be said about the homogenization effect of Omnath, and not just Omnath, but cards that slot into that deck really well. Aragorn is a good example. Fourth Earlingus is a good example until it was pointed. And obviously all the cantrips that are highly played, Brainstorm Ponder, Lightning Bolt, Misstep, those 1-mana spells too, around what draws players into that archetype, and what we could do to prop up those 3-color shard decks like Nyapod, Bant Company, Sultai Midrange, Sultai Control into competing to be just as viable as the Omnath, Jund, and Grixis decks.
I feel like the Omnath descriptor on this deck is interesting because it's a very easy way to describe the colors, but I think it's having a similar effect on the deck that calling Grixis midrange back in Highlander circa 2017-2018 had when we called Grixis midrange Kess Pile. And that had an effect where people were focusing on the card that is the namesake of the deck. And
Yeah, I
it's
agree.
not necessarily the thing that is the most broken or the card that you need to be focused on within the archetype.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And Cass Pile was named Cass Pile long after Cass was gone. You just Pile followed the same fate. It was really fun to play non-white mid-range, but you just fell by the wayside. But it was still fun to call it You Just Pile, you know. So perhaps we'll find a time where that color, that 4-color no black mid-range decks decide they might not need Omnath. But I don't know if it's going to be any time in the future, because although it's like agree, another card in a deck full of good cards, it is quite a good card, you know. And we saw, I think there was maybe like 4, 3. There was a couple of decks that we would call Prison, and they're more or less lands decks. And those one of those lands decks, I believe, also had an Omnath in it, you know. So it's like it's important to kind of identify the idea of what an Omnath deck looks like. But it's going to be really interesting over the next 3 months or so until the next points update is whether or not the difference between Omnath Walks and Omnath Midrange becomes more present, because Time Walk is like a really interesting card in the fact that it's 10 billion points, you know, 5 points to play 1 card in your deck. But people who have it or have access to it, and sometimes even before they have access to it, will go for that time walk version because there's enough good unpointed cards that you don't have to play Omnath point soup. You can play just really targeted, try to win the game, backdoor combo.
Yeah, James C's had some success with that list before moving to Grixis, where he was playing Omnath Walks without the walk, but still playing the Eternal Witness and the Soul Herder, which the actual Omnath Walks deck has moved off. So there is a lot of variance in those deck types, but I think it is something to consider in the sense of we're seeing a lot more 4-color decks than perhaps we'd seen before compared to 3-color decks. And the draw card is cards like Omnath or Expressive Iteration that draw you into colors where you perhaps wouldn't have been, and also the powerful nature of the sideboard blasts, which are everywhere.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, let's just
Um,
have a bit of a deep dive into the Omnath versus the Walks deck and how they did at the tournament. There was a definite prevalence of the Walks deck just doing a little bit better than the generic mid-range deck. But if you look at those who were placing just below the top 50, so the top quarter of the event, we had 5 Walks decks, which were in that range, and then 3 mid-range decks who made it into the top 50 as well. Then, as we go out, the lowest placing Walks deck was 91st place, so still within the top half of the event, whereas the last placing mid-range deck was back at 162. So I think there's a reasonable power level in terms of how well they can place for both of them, but at the same time, the Walks deck has a much higher floor on what it can do if you're a good pilot with it, I would say.
Yeah, I think, and we mentioned this, I think we probably mentioned it a lot, and it's worth mentioning again, is that we do have still player bias or pilot bias probably in the format where Omnath's Walk's pretty difficult deck actually, and it's kind of goes on a different axis to mid-range because mid-range it's very forgiving. I think you said it was just like a very um, easy for anyone to have a go at because all the cards are just good. So you're kind of just trying to cast them on curve. But with Omnath Walks, like you do need to have some practice with the deck and see like, am I going to go for the combo here? Am I going to try and go for something else? And it's like kind of puts your mind in a different place to the mid-range deck. So I think spiritually they might be different, but you just got to be careful about when we see high-performing Omnath decks. They're also like sometimes it's the players who are really good, and that kind of skews the results sometimes. Moving on, 51 combo decks in the event. That is 26% of the total meta, so just over a quarter. And that's probably fine. I mean, we want combo decks and aggro and control to kind of live in harmony. But we always see that kind of leaking through of mid-range decks, and I think that's probably just the nature of the format. But I think combo decks have seen a bit of a tick up. Like we see 13 Breach to no one's surprise, but and 9 Oracle. But something that I've seen as a Reanimator aficionado myself is that 9 copies of Reanimator at the event, 60 people playing Reanimate, but whatever, 9 players playing Reanimate, and then also like a 3. I separated them because I thought it was interesting that there was 3 blue green X creature cheaty decks, like a deck that would play an Atraxa or a Atraxa or a Grizzlebrand, but they're not using their graveyard at all, and they're not using any black mana at all, and so you're seeing like natural order. We saw Chris Melly, who was the highest placing 8-point list at 34th, I think, and he was playing this sort of rug sneak and show deck that also just played like Minsk and Ragavan. So it's kind of like pretty interesting that you could do this kind of combo thing where you might just cast a natural order and ask your opponent, can you beat an Atraxa? But also like, can you beat a Ragavan is also just as difficult as a question. We also saw 1 copy of Blue Black Annihilator 6, which is a callback to a really old South Australian creation of think Splinter
Salve?
Twin, but instead of yeah, well, exactly Sav, but he brought it to the forefront in 7 Point Highlander. But think Splinter Twin, but instead of Splinter Twin and Kiki Jiki, you're using Shallow Grave and Emrakul. So it's just like you're trying to play control-y, but you're also like just putting a giant creature on the battlefield when you get the opportunity. 7 copies of Flash Hulk, and 1 copy of Storm. So kind of an interesting one as well. And we see a smattering of one deck showings. So someone was playing Luris Painter combo, so Painter Grindstone, which is kind of neat. Jeskai Time Vault, which is neat. Infect Doomsday. One just called creature combo, which gets me really excited. Maybe we're doing some Devoted Druid shenanigans. Channel Mirror Bomberman 4-Color Academy. So it's good to know that if you want a combo, because combo tickles a specific part of your brain. If you want a combo, you're not locked into Breach, you're not locked into Oracle. And, even now that we're seeing more Reanimator and more Flash Hulk, it's very viable. You can have a go. And if you don't want to do that, then that was only maybe half of the, probably 3/4 of the decks. So it's like a smattering of like 10 or 8 or 10 decks that are just fun combo decks, and that's like heartwarming to see as well, I think.
Yeah, and I guess like sure, none of those decks placed technically in the top 8. One Breach Pilot was tied on points with the final place in the top 8. Bomberman was also up there. Chris, as we mentioned, finished high on an 8-point deck with Sneak and Show, which is that creature cheaty blue-green pile. And then there were 2 Flash Hulk decks in the top 16. So there's definitely a lot of combo that is really close to those top and is playing at those top tables and really close to the top 8. So I think if you're looking to play that archetype, it's entirely viable. The one kind of, I guess, thing we haven't talked about, and if you've been probably looking, you might have noticed that all those numbers are close to 30%, is like, where is the control in this? And that was the smallest represented share of the metagame with only 11.1% and 22 control decks. Some of those control decks, and obviously Blue Moon can sometimes be tempo, can sometimes be control, depending on the suite of cards. And we've just lumped them all together in control. One in the top 8, 2 Jeskai control, a Sultai control, a Grixis control, and a 5-color control. And then on the other side of that, some prison/ramp effects. And bots being in this space is they could easily be in aggro, but bots and shops can also just power out some taxing artifacts or creatures that limit your ability to interact with them, and you just die to not being able to cast your own spells while they'll kill you with like a 5/4 or something that costs 7 mana and they played it on turn 2. Mono white playing things like Balance, Armageddon also can be an aggro deck, just like they can balance you. They can cast Serra on turn 1 or something nonsense like that and put some 4/4s into play and you're dead. So the prison ramp decks are in this really unique spot where they can leverage the prison aspect and the aggressive aspect really well to either kill you or stop you from playing the game. Really cool list in there is the Esper prison list that I think an ex-committee member put together, Anatoly Lightfoot, who has been pretty active in the Discord, and it's playing a lot of enchantments and effects like the Abyss that limit your ability to attack or go to combat. I think the Motive might be in the deck even.
That excites me a lot.
So
Tribal Legends enchantment, you could say.
yeah, so that's really cool to see that, like, and I think this was part of what I really enjoyed about the day and what people said on the 7 Point Highlander podcast was there were so many decks that are viable, and I really like, from that perspective, I like the committee's idea of depowering the top decks to make those other decks a bit more viable into those top decks, which I think is a really kind of commendable position to have. So I'm excited to see what the next event will look like with a similar split. But in terms of control, prison, and ramp, I think there's some really promising signs there. And maybe with some depointings of key cards in those archetypes, we might see them increase their percentage metagame share.
I think this is a really interesting time for control. I think control always have this problem of you have to know the format pretty well because you got to know what to counter, you got to know what to hold on for. Like, is my opponent going to play 4 Theralingus and me lose the game? Like, there's a bunch of cards now that are just like really impossible to deal with, and for a control deck, a homogenous meta is kind of good for control decks because you know what to play against, you know what to expect. But like, they will see this pain until they start until other decks, I guess, start getting pointed. Is that it is just hard to play control. It's a difficult time, and so to see only 11 control decks and 11 prison decks, and prison obviously a different conversation, but I would be really interested in finding ways to make control better. And I think they're going to be fighting an uphill battle, but could be the time. I mean, we've seen a lot of really good cards come out of there lately. Like Jace became depointed last year, I think, and then Snapcaster's on the watch list. Snapcaster still being one of the most pointed cards is going to be make it difficult to go down to 0. But it's good to see that that's on the sort of committee's eye.
Yeah, one thing that's always been interesting about control is that you need to be able to control the early game so that you can get to the late game and take over. And the recent trend of Wizards in the last 2 to 3 years has to be play the most broken 1, 2, and 3 drops, and it makes it harder for you to get ahead of the game. You can't just play a Wrath on turn 4 now and assume that you're going to take over the game. You need to be able to do more, and it means that you need to adjust the way that you're building control. And people have, I think, started to work that out, and we're starting to see it get back into the format as well.
Absolutely. And before we cap it off for archetypes, I think it's great and fun to talk about deck naming. I think this is a situation that comes up every now and then. Is like, how much of a meme is my deck list name? Is that a problem? And also on the other side of the coin is like, deck naming is a fun way to sort of establish yourself as a player because of your deck. People talk about, we just talked about Annihilator 6 as like this deck that has a weird name. We talked about Moonshine, we talked about Eclipse, and these are like deck names that exist because the community decided that they exist. And I think that's like a really commendable way to do it. I think, at least from our opinion as people who ingest data, making them lumpable with other decks, really good. I don't five color nonsense pile as a mono red aggro deck is funny. No, it didn't happen, but it's funny. But it doesn't quite sort of help the people who are analyzing the data. So obviously, we're doing our best we can to name your deck appropriately, but also keep those fun names coming. So if it's good and it makes sense and I like it, then you might see it on a future. You might see it on a future presentation.
So, you said that we were about to move off archetype breakdown, but there's one final thing that we need to get into. Now, you did petition the community for opinions, and we got a couple of questions back on Facebook and Discord, and Tyrone Phillips asks you, why did goblins get robbed? Can you tell me that, Angus?
I think I'm trying to be really respectful. We said at the top of the cast, like, take it as a badge of honor. Goblin Recruiter on the points list. But in reality, I think it was an overcorrection. I think it was something that didn't need to necessarily be punished. Like, Goblins is a cool deck, little guys turning sideways, and it's strong. I mean, we don't see tribal decks in the format, and Goblins is very popular. It's a very popular archetype. And I think the idea of Goblin Recruiter being pointed is the same reason that it was banned in Legacy, which is it just takes so goddamn long to resolve. And I think, and we were mentioning before about splashing Goblin Recruiter for Bombardiers and stuff where like incidental goblins, but what we're not talking about is perhaps someone who is playing goblins at their event for the first few times, then you get a little bit of decision paralysis because suddenly you have a goblin recruiter on the stack and I don't know what I'm going to do. Like sometimes it's easy, conspicuous Snoop and friends can help make that happen for you. But goblin recruiter as a point, I probably would have waited a little bit longer. I think that it's good that goblins are good and I want to promote that kind of behavior. So up the goblins, down the point.
I do think it does fall into the same space as Spellseeker. However, where it's like it's a card that allows a deck like Goblins, which is playing an effective aggro game anyway, and is playing a really strong Plan A or Plan B, whichever way you want to look at the combo, to have all these inbuilt other ways it can win the game through one card. And so you can be constricting Goblins really well and dealing with their threats, and suddenly they get a recruiter and you've spent card for card answering all their other threats to not die, and then you lose to that. Inversely, they can just go off with recruiter, Snoop, Kiki Jiki, Sling Gang, whatever kind of combo they want to put together, while you're kind of trying to combat any other aspect the deck is grinding on, whether it's their fast mana or their creatures making tokens like Rival Master Squeeze, so on. So I think that it does. I don't think it's on the same level as Spellseeker because it requires you can have so many more interactive points. But the way they can stack those piles can actually mean that your interaction doesn't even matter. If they can untap, sometimes they can put a Churgeon on top with the Snoop so that you can't even spell their creatures. So there's definitely an argument there for it to be pointed from power level. I agree with you, Angus, that perhaps it wasn't there yet, but I think it would be something that they would have to do eventually. Whether it needed to happen at the same time as Mana Crypt, I think we'll have to wait and see if Goblins is still a powerful deck. All of the players that play that deck are very good players. So I think that also is going to have an impact on the sense that they're still going to put up good results. They are incredible players.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that you don't think it was there yet because I feel from a Melbourne point of view where Luke Mulcahy, former committee member, has been consistently putting up results with Goblins for the last 2 to 3 years and the deck just keeps getting better and better, and it might just be a metagame shift that maybe it's not as prevalent in Canberra, but it definitely to me feels like it's a deck that is up there in terms of results, and it top eight of the event, and there was Tyrone in ninth place on the same record to be able to get into top eight, and several others up there in the rankings as well.
And I think the other thing is the configuration aspect of that means now Crypt and Recruiter is 6, so they can't play Minsk and Boo as a splat, like a extra powerful card. They can't play, not that they were playing Ragavan, but some of them were playing Orcish Bowmasters. It limits the extra card that they're allowed to play, which I think is actually a good deck building decision.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point.
So let's have a look at our 8-point list. So we
Yeah.
ended up with 30 decks that were on 8 points. To give you a few facts about them, there was 9 of them were playing Mana Crypt decks, which someone was interested in, and we'll also have a quick glance through the 2-color decks as well. There was 36 2-color decks, and 10 of those decks were playing 8 points as well. And then an additional 5 of them were just playing a single dual land, and without that dual land would have been no reserve list card. So there's a decision that people are making, and it seems to be that they think that having just a single dual land is worth more than having that additional point. As something that's meant to be encouraging new people to join the format, do you think that the 8-point clause is doing its job?
This is really interesting, and perhaps Jordan can further elaborate on it because it's technically his point. But something that really I appreciated was we're still in a really early stage of 8 points. You know, like it's very fertile ground for discovery, and still very early days. I think I'm actually just of the opinion that it should maybe just be 9 points. Like it hits in your head as a rule. It's the accessibility rule. You're allowed to play 1 extra point, but why not +1 to the accessibility rule? Like instead of 8, it's 9 now. You know, so it's not necessarily a rule change if people considered it 9 points. But honestly, from this event and from discussions with, anecdotal discussions, of course, but like a lot of people did get into the format because of that allure. So I'm not 100% sure if it's 8 or 9, God forbid 10, but I know that there are people who are. What I want outside of new players coming into the format is I want people to be like, is it better for me to play an 8-point list, or is it better for me to play City of Traders, Mox Diamond, in one player's case, Shallow Grave, you know, or even those like loose duels? Like the duels is like a serious consideration, you know, and we saw some really good many color decks that were 8 points, which is something that has actually changed a little bit, including Jacob coming back with 8-point Reanimator from CanBrawl, where he placed in the top 4. And also there's like 8-point Omnath Midrange, 8-point 8-point Jun Saga. So like we are kind of delving our feet into decks that are inexpensive and also multiple colors. But what I would really like to see is to just see maybe there's a Blood Moon deck that is good that is 8 points. But because Mox Diamond City of Traders exists, all of red black Eclipse or red white, they just like don't want to play 8 points. They want to play their fun cards. And like playing fun cards is a different discussion, but like I would like people to start scratching their heads as whether or not it's worth it to cut these 1 or 2 reserve list cards for the opportunity to play 1 or 2 extra points.
So the way you're talking about the rule at the moment is that you think that people playing with no reserve list should be able to, the deck should be on an equal power level to what the rest of the format is currently playing at 7 points. Whereas my understanding of the rule is it's introduced as something to promote accessibility, and it means that you not necessarily going to be on that same 7-point power level straight away, but at the same time, it means that you don't have to sell your firstborn in order to be able to afford the cards and get into the format. You can just play with what you have available to yourself, and that means you might just get a little bit of an extra boost when you do that as well. Do you think that that people coming into the format for the first time with this rule should be able to compete at the highest level, or do you think it's just an introduction to get your your toe in the water before you dive straight into getting the full reserve list versions?
I mean, in the ideal world, it would be that old El Paso ad where the teenage girl says, "Why don't we have both?" Where it's both a foot in the door, and it also both does have the opportunity to be a really competitive decision. And I think we're really close to that, and we have seen 8-point decks in top eights of major events. The last CanBrawl event was CanBrawl 2 or CanBrawl 1 was
CanBrawl
the
2,
second
yeah.
place was a 8-point burn.
Yeah. First place was mono white.
First place is mono white, but I think it had City of Traders.
Okay, there you go. Interesting.
But those kinds of mana crypt strategies are what people started building with the 8-point, and now we're seeing Simic Tempo, we're seeing Sneak and Show, we're seeing Jun's Saga, we're seeing even Omnath Midrange. Decks that people would have said, no, you can't do that.
Yeah.
So I think that is happening, and as that happens more, people will start to experiment with different configurations of points. There is a kind of huge groupthink around 8-point, and I think that my only concern is that as we point the cards that are available to 8-point players, their decks lose power at a non-comparable rate. As mana crypt goes up, those 8-point decks are significantly more affected than a deck that can still play City of Traders, that can still play Mox Diamond, that can still play all of those other cards that 8-point list can't play. So it's something for us to consider is that if we're pointing mana crypt, which we should be, and I agree with that, how are we allowing those 8-point decks to kind of sneak in an extra kind of boost to their power if they're not able to play City of Traders, Mox Diamond, and so on. But also you can't depoint cards like, Jitte to go in that deck because that will just go in the 7-point list. And so then that also increases in power. I think it's a really difficult decision because on face value, when you think about it, Mox Diamond probably isn't worth a point. And neither is City of Traders, arguably. And when we think about Ancient Tomb also be a point, that means if you're an 8 point, 6 of your points and you're playing an aggressive deck are taken up by your fast mana package.
Yeah.
And so that's a bit different to a deck that, yes, 7-point lists also have 6 points dedicated to their fast mana, but can still play a slew of other cards to improve their access to fast mana. And I guess that idea of accessibility also comes down to cards like Gaia's Cradle, super expensive. It's a really good card, but it's really expensive. There are a range of pointed cards that are pointed for their cost, such as Library of Alexandria, which is really inaccessible and the potential that it might homogenize the format. But there are other expensive cards that are, floating around in the format that we probably also should consider on that same lens, if that is where the committee wants to take that.
I think the only other point, just to cap this off, is just expanding what you said, is that it is really hard to point decks without it's hard to point decks without red 8-point lists getting splash damage, and it does affect their configurations, and that's why I think turning them to 9 points is like actually just the easiest option, because it's like I like the idea that Gaia's Cradle is ... half a point. I like that City of Traders is ... half a point. And I want it to feel like that. I want you to feel like you're like, well, I could just drop this Mox Diamond and then I could play blah, blah, blah. And like whether or not you have a Mox Diamond, I think should actually just be irrelevant. I think it should be, if the true promotion of bringing new people into the format, I don't want to trick them. I don't want them to come in and be like, whoa, 8-point list, that's cool. And it's actually just a trick to get the lower half of the 190 players to start losing events. I don't want anyone to feel dejected because their decks are just less powerful. And that's a really difficult thing to measure. And I think it's something to bring into the conversation. But again, I think it's still really fertile ground for more discussion.
100%, yeah.
Yeah. Well, what you've said is definitely interesting in terms of focusing points towards the reserve list decks rather than the no reserve list decks, because there was a recent discussion about whether City of Traders would be a good point for the Stompy based decks, because it means that it hits the 7-point decks without hitting those playing the same archetype in 8 points and still leaving it viable. What would you think about that?
Again, I suppose so, but it might just feel inelegant, I suppose. Like, City of Traders a 1-point card, maybe, but are we thinking of it more as a 1-point card because we don't want to give 8-point players a point? Maybe. It's interesting and it's definitely worth discussing. But I think I would make that consideration because we know, by the way, we know that the committee does make those considerations on price when they're choosing between two good pointing options. And if there's two good pointing options that they believe will work, and one of them is a very expensive card and one of them is a not very expensive card, they will lean towards that more expensive card. And I think maybe that same analysis or that same rule can be given to a reserve list card over a non-reserve list card. So absolutely, I think that's worth considering.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for this discussion. I think it's been enlightening. I'm going to have a quick talk, though, about what's coming up in the next couple of months with Highlander. On the 8th of March at the ANZ Super Series in Melbourne, which is a Friday, there is a Highlander event being run by Glenn of Good Games. There is a mock emerald for first place for that. On the 23rd of March in 2024, Pat's MTG's Bazaar is running the third CanBrawl event. There's going to be a Tropical Island for first and a Bayou for second. Moving into the start of the next month, on the 7th of April 2024, we're going to have a points announcement. We don't know what's going to happen in that one, but I'm sure there'll be a stream for it. And then finally, on the 27th of April, plenty of games. Pat, MTG Bazaar, and MTG Mate are getting together to run an event called the Mana Clash, where they say they're going to have Highlander Worlds. There's a Time Walk for first and a Mox Emerald for second. Now, for those three events that we just mentioned, tickets are all on sale now, and we will put some links in the show notes for you to have a look at. But we hope to see you at any of those that you happen to be attending. Angus, thank you very much for having me. Jordan as well.
Thank you so much for joining us as well, and look forward to talking more data in the future.
Let's get that bread.